Hello, I'm Anthony. What I'm going to demonstrate to you today is the kind of things you're looking to do when you're doing your CCTV practical assessment. Also, what you're likely to come across in an actual control room environment. I'm going to run you through exactly what we would expect you to do and know when doing your CCTV assessments at the end of your course. Firstly, let's look at the control room environment and what you'd expect to see in an average sized control room. A control room could be a small one-man environment with only one screen and maybe 4 monitors, versus a much larger room with maybe 2 or 3 operators operating 300 to 400 cameras at a time. Behind me, you can see a typical bank of monitors, and those cameras there are normally made up of multiple screens and then screens within screens, which are displayed using a multiplexer. A multiplexer allows multiple cameras to appear on a single screen. Up front, in front of me here, we have what's typically known as a spot monitor. Now, if I've got a camera that is a pan-tilt zoom or PTZ camera, we would bring that camera onto the spot monitor by selecting it on a controller or using a mouse and keyboard. In this example, we have a typical type of controller that you could find in some control rooms. Understandably, they differ from manufacturer to manufacturer and control room to control room. You could be using just simply a mouse and keyboard to control your cameras, or you could be using a piece of kit that looks similar to this. Once we selected a camera, using our keypad to select whichever camera designated number we want, we then will bring that up onto the spot monitor. At that point, we will be able to control that camera if it's a PTZ camera. PTZ simply stands for pan-tilt zoom. So, if I wanted to pan the camera, I would simply take my controller and I would pan to the right, pan to the left. I could tilt the camera up, tilt the camera down, and in this case we've got ourselves a twist model. So that twist would be your zoom in and out. So we'd normally zoom in this way and zoom out that way. At the top of the controller, we have a switch here, which is programmable. So as the name suggests, it could be programmed for different functions. A good function for this top switch may be something like a camera reset, or in this case, we would use it for screenshots. Screenshots are really important when we're doing our job because it gives us a nice clear still image of a suspect, action, event, or vehicle. These objects, vehicles, or people could later be used as evidence in court cases should a crime have taken place. In addition to our controller, we're also going to perhaps have a couple of different means of getting in contact with the outside world, outside the control room. Now, these could be as simple as just a telephone landline, or it could be more complex where you have multiple different options to communicate with. For example, we might have a landline for taking outside calls and dealing with general public and company concerns, as well as radios that are linked to town centers, and these are linked normally to reduce crime. Systems such as PubLink as well as TownLink are often used, other systems such as Connect. These radio systems are often used by towns, pubs, clubs and bars, as well as town center shops, all linked via radio directly back to a central control room, often run by a council. Additional to this, you may also have a direct radio link or phone link with the police. If you're using Airwave, for example, that's a direct radio link communication with the police. This is very helpful if we're working closely with the police carrying out our duties. Using Airwave, we can pass information very efficiently between the police, us, as well as the outside operators and third parties. When you first arrive at work in a control room, the first thing you're going to have to do is access that control room. And again, there's a number of different options available in order to gain access. It may be a key card, key fob, biometric system, or perhaps you have an operator who's always in the control room 24 hours a day who have to buzz you in once you show your ID. So there's a number of different ways to access the control room. The first thing you're going to do when you get into the control room is sign in. This is part of an audit trail that is very, very important to keep up to date at all times. There will be the time we signed in, the date, our name, our signature, and perhaps if you're using an SIA license to work where you're working, also your SIA license number as well. Once you've signed in, the next step normally would be, in a 24-hour control room type scenario, is to have a debrief and briefing with your colleagues who are on the previous shift. Now, this is normally done as part of a handover. It's vitally important that we run through the handover with our colleague before they leave for the day. Whether it's a typed up email or in fact a written handover, it's very important that we understand exactly what was written on that handover. Anything that's a little bit ambiguous or we're not clear on needs to be clarified with the colleague who's leaving before they leave, and it may become more difficult to understand what they've told us about the systems, any ongoing incidents, or anything else that's included in that handover. One reason we do a handover check before doing functional checks and getting settled in for work is to make sure that no faults have been reported already. The last thing you want to do is run through a functional check, find a fault, and then end up going through the process of reporting that fault, only to find that that report's already been listed and an engineer's already been contacted to repair it. That's a waste of time for both yourselves as well as potentially getting a double engineer booked out to repair an issue. Modern shifts in control rooms can be up to 12 hours with only 2 shifts running in a 24-hour cycle. Or perhaps you're on a lesser shift of an 8-hour shift. You're still going to be sat in your position for a lengthy period of time. So it's very important that your control room setup is complete. That includes adjusting your seating, your screen height, how far away you are from the screens, making sure you're comfortable, and you're set up and ready to go for your shift. Once your control room is set up for your use, the first thing you're going to do is run through your system functional check. Now, granted, on a system with 300-400 cameras, this may take some time, but that's why we're also relying on the handover from our colleagues to make sure that when they left, everything was functioning. To run through a functional check, what you want to do is you want to run through all your cameras, or as close to that number as is reasonably practicable, and make sure that they're working as you'd expect. This would include having an image on screen for a start, so that you can actually see what's going on with the camera, as well as checking all your pan, tilt, zoom cameras are functioning correctly. Now, the way you would normally do that is you would select your cameras one at a time, especially if you knew your camera map and you knew how many pan, tilt, zoom cameras you have. You would select those cameras and just do a quick wiggle to make sure that the cameras are actually functioning as expected. So a quick left, right, up, down, little zoom in, little zoom out. That's more than enough to make sure that the system's functioning normally. If you were to find that the camera is not functioning normally, either the pan, tilt, zoom doesn't appear to be working properly, you'd need to run a quick troubleshoot to make sure, 1, is this a pan, tilt, zoom camera that you've selected? And 2, are we expecting it to be working? And 3, is there an image coming through at all? Because if there's no image coming through at all, then it could be something like a loose connection, which of course in a town center control room, that loose connection could be anywhere, which may require an engineer to come out to repair it. We may have some troubleshooting techniques that we use beforehand. In other words, a quick power on, power off of a particular system just to see if that reboots it. If something's not functioning correctly and we can't repair it, we would have to log a call to our engineering company to come out and assess what the damage is and if there's anything that needs replacing. If you do have to do this, it must be reported correctly and the correct paperwork needs to be filled in. Normally, we would have to fill in a fault log to just notify anybody else looking that a fault has been reported, who reported the fault, the time and date they reported the fault, what actions were taken, and any repair work that was carried out. When an engineer comes out to repair any systems, they would normally fill out their section of the fault report too, and of course, if it has been repaired, mark it down as repaired. All right, in a situation now where we're working, we're halfway through a shift, and we're carrying out what we call a camera patrol. Now, if you're working in a major control room, you're going to probably carry out a number of camera patrols throughout the day. First thing is, especially if you're new in a control room and it's a large control room with multiple cameras, is learning your camera map. And there's a method to this. We normally want to learn sort of areas at a time. So our cameras are normally going to be numbered, and they're going to start with camera 1 and then work their way up to whatever the maximum amount of cameras you have. Some of these may change over time if parts are replaced or cameras are replaced, and you'll find an odd number in the middle of the town center, for example, but you'll get to know those as well. It's also important to know that if I'm tracking somebody and they're about to move on to a different camera's point of view or a different camera's area, I need to know where that camera is, what the number of that camera is, so I can select it quickly without losing contact with my target. Now, the likelihood is, in some situations, that camera may not be perfectly positioned when I'm switching, say, from camera 3 to camera 5. The camera 5 may be pointing in a slightly different orientation to where I'm tracking a target. So if that's the case, if we're part of a team, we can work together, and my colleague sitting next to me can actually position camera 5 in the knowledge that I'm about to switch to it, in which case, when I switch to camera 5, it's perfectly set up. But if I'm working single crew, or my colleague is working on another incident and perhaps they're not able to assist me on this, I need to be pretty quick at getting that camera to bear. If I'm slow, what could happen is my target could disappear down an alleyway, and then I'm going to really struggle to reacquire them. So in this situation, what we're doing is we're carrying out a routine patrol, and we notice somebody standing in an alleyway on the side of an industrial area. And they seem to be standing there for some time, which gets our interest. At this point, all we're going to do is we're just going to zoom in slightly. So we're just going to zoom ourselves in ever so slightly to have a look and use our curiosity here to determine what they're up to. Are they just standing there? Have they got access to the building? They haven't committed a crime as far as I can tell. But in this scenario, I've zoomed in. They're standing outside, and I've noticed they're loitering there for a few minutes. That's going to make me interested. So I'm going to watch them, watch their behavior. If they're wandering around the area, I'm just going to track them for a little while. Now, if I can't see any obvious signs that they're up to no good, we have another, let's say in this scenario, 300 cameras that we need to patrol. We can't stay focused on this one person for too long. However, we can return back to them if we're still not 100% happy with their behavior. We can carry on with our patrol and maybe revisit that camera in about 5 or 6 minutes time and see if we can see any progress with that person. In this scenario, we can see our target is standing by the door, and they're looking, or appear to be looking, to be trying to gain entry into what appears to be a locked building. You can see that the target opens the door and gains entry. At that point, we're going to move on, because clearly that person was maybe on a call or something like that we couldn't see. Maybe they were hands-free. I couldn't see they were holding a phone, and they were having a chat to someone outside. Perhaps the signal inside wasn't very good, and there was no harm done there. So we carry on with our patrol. In the next scenario, we'll look at that same scenario again, where clearly the target, or the suspect in this point, is acting in a suspicious way, and we can see that they are gaining or attempting to gain entry. Our first thing we need to do is we need to center them into the camera and zoom into what we call 100% zoom. Now, 100% zoom is where the top of the target's head is at the top of the screen, and the bottom of their feet is at the bottom of the screen. Now, that's what we're referring to when we say 100% zoom. It doesn't mean that I zoom the camera in to maximum zoom and we can't see anything. What you may notice when you zoom in from a camera that may be some distance away is that the camera will attempt to autofocus. Most modern CCTV systems do not require input from operators to focus. There is always a manual override, but these are not really necessary to use. If we zoom in substantially, and you can see the camera goes out of focus, how we clean that up normally is we simply just slowly draw the camera back again just a little bit, and you'll see the camera will reattempt to focus, and then it'll sharpen up that image. Remember, a blurry image is not going to be very useful as evidence. So we need to get that camera zoomed out nicely so we can get that sharp image back. Once we've got the sharp image back, we can again close distance back to 100% zoom. The image should stay relatively sharp. What we're looking to do with a suspect is we're looking to be able to give a detailed description of that person. If I was to screenshot, for example, use our screenshot button at the top here, or there's another screenshot button on the side here, we would take that screenshot to produce it as evidence to hand over to the police for a potential investigation. We'll go back into evidence gathering a little bit later on because there is a process we will follow for that as well. But for the sake of the description here of a suspect, what we're looking to do is give the clearest description that we possibly can with what we can see. We don't want to fill in any gaps ourselves. We certainly don't want to add our opinion to anything. We just want to give clear and concise descriptions of what we can see. So it may be, if I was describing a target on camera, we would normally start with ethnicity. Now, this is your opinion of their ethnicity. It's not their own opinion of their ethnicity. It's what you're seeing. You are the witness. Once we've given ethnicity, we will then go through gender. Again, this is your opinion of their gender. Then apparent age, build, clothing, distinguishing marks, hair and height, gait, which is the way they walk, if that's something that's worth mentioning. Quite often somebody's gait can be something that is a telltale sign of who they are. They might have a very specific walk that they have. And those are the important elements that we need. Now, essentially, we may be working very quickly and we might be talking on a radio, so we're going to give slightly less information but more pertinent. So we would say, for example, someone like a white male, age between 35 and 40, of average build, wearing the following clothing, and we would start at the top. If they're wearing a hat, describe the hat best we can, color, then we go down to jacket, overcoat, shirt, whatever they're wearing there, and then color of that, and of course then onto the trousers, color, whether they're shorts, longs, whatever, and then shoes, again, with as much detail as we could possibly see without filling anything in. If you're unable to see something clearly, don't try and fill in the blanks yourself. Just be very clear that you can't see clearly. You could just say, for example, it's a dark shirt with a light motif on it, maybe perhaps sports motif, but you don't want to go and start naming companies off, because if you do that and it's incorrect, you're going to put yourself in a position. There's two other elements we need to be aware of. Age. When giving age of somebody, what we want to do is we want to give ourselves an approximate age. So there's two ways to do that. You can either go early, mid, late. For example, the suspect looked to be in their early, mid, or late 20s, obviously selecting one of those. So early 20s, mid 20s, late 20s. Or perhaps you could just give them a 5-year age gap. So they appear to be aged between 20 and 25 years old, or they appear to be aged between 30 and 35 years old. You don't want to go too large in the age, in the sense of age 30 to 40, because that gets a little vague at this point, especially if we're looking to build a case for evidence for the police to perhaps prosecute somebody. So 5 years is a good way to do it. The other thing you want to potentially estimate is height. Now with CCTV, especially if it's an elevated camera, you are in a position where you may not be able to give it exact heights. You're going to have to use the environment around and make some assumptions. Again, don't go too tight on the height. You want to give it, again, and if you're measuring in feet and inches, give it about 2 inches. So for example, appeared to be between 6 foot and 6'2" in height. If someone appears to be exceptionally tall, you could mention that appears to be well over 6 foot in height. So you're establishing that the person's very tall. If you're unsure of their height, again, you should always say that you're unsure of their height. With gender, if you're unsure, always be clear that you're not entirely sure whether it's a male or female. If a suspect is moving through an area, they might be moving quite quickly on foot, they might have a scooter, it might be a motorized scooter, and they're moving quite quickly. One thing we need to try and avoid in that scenario is spending too much time fully zoomed in. The reason we do that is because if that target was to suddenly change direction, it's very hard to keep them in frame. And once they leave the frame, then it may be difficult to reacquire that target. Another thing that could happen is, let's say that this person was caught on camera assaulting somebody. Ideally, you want to keep that person in frame until they're detained by the police, because then they cannot ever use the excuse of mistaken identity, because we have them in frame for the entire duration from the moment they carried out whatever offense it was to the moment they were apprehended. Now, this may not always be possible because you may have to switch cameras. Again, very important to have a colleague set the other camera up ready for you to switch. Let's talk about a scenario now where we do lose contact with our target or suspect. If that was to occur and I was zoomed in, my first protocol is to zoom the camera out as much as is reasonably practical. I want to be able to zoom out, increase my situational awareness, and see if I can reacquire the target. Normally I'm going to use things that stand out, like their clothing that they were wearing, perhaps they had bright trainers on or something like that, just for myself personally to try and reacquire that target. Now, if I've zoomed out and for whatever reason I still can't regain the target, I'm going to use a little bit of local knowledge. So your local knowledge comes in where you know the direction the target was traveling and you can assume which direction they may have gone. At that point, we may select another camera. For example, we might select camera 12, and that camera now comes alive. Now that camera might be pointing the wrong direction, so I'll need to turn that camera around to get focus on the target. If I can reacquire the target that way, excellent. If I still can't reacquire the target, I may need to use colleagues on the ground to assist me, and I do that by using my radio systems and communicating exactly what the target looks like to the best of my ability and pass that information to colleagues on the ground or perhaps the police on the ground and our last known location of the target, direction of travel, and what time that was. So these are key important elements we need to include if we have lost contact with a target. We discussed earlier tracking and targeting an individual on foot, but now let's have a look at what we could do to track or trace a vehicle. So obviously not everyone's going to be on foot. Somebody on foot may get into a vehicle. A vehicle may be traveling a lot faster and cover a lot more distance quickly. So therefore, we need to be very good with our camera map to know which cameras to switch to in order to keep that target tracked. We may have different software available where we're working, which may assist us with tracking, facial recognition, as well as ANPR for tracking vehicle number plates. Typically, in order to get a vehicle to a position which is going to give us enough evidence for court, we want to zoom into approximately 50% zoom. Now, what that means is the vehicle does not have to fit the whole screen and be 100% zoom. It can fit about half the screen. Key ingredient here is, are we able to have a clear look at the number plate? Not always practical, not always possible. Sometimes the angles are wrong. When tracking people in a vehicle, it can quite often be very difficult to give a full description of that person, especially if you've got an elevated camera position and it's pretty bright out. What tends to happen in those circumstances is the light from above reflects clearly off the front window of the car, the windshield, and it makes it very difficult to see anybody inside the car. However, sometimes you might be lucky and they might go across a shadow or something like that, which might give you a moment where you get a clear image of people in the car. So being at a 50% zoom is going to give you a fairly good image of that person. This would also depend on the type of cameras we're using and their resolution. Cameras operating at a 4K resolution are going to give you a clearer image than a camera operating at a lower resolution. Back to the vehicle. If we're at a 50% zoom, we could screenshot the vehicle at a time where you can get a clear read of the number plate. That would be the ideal shot, so front or rear shot, so you can get a clear read of the plate. And that could then be used as evidence later on. For vehicle descriptions, we follow something called SCRIM, which is a simple acronym so we don't forget anything obvious about that vehicle. SCRIM stands for shape, color, registration, identifying marks, make, and model. So S stands for shape. Now, when we're talking about a shape with a vehicle, what we're really referring to is it a car, is it a van, is it a truck? The next one is pretty straightforward. That's the color. Color of the vehicle. And again, if you're on night vision, you might not be able to give a clear representation of the color, as your camera has probably gone to low light mode, and then you're going to only be able to see sort of black and white, so it might not be as easy to tell. You may only be able to give whether it's a light colored car or a dark colored car. The registration plate is very important. If we can screenshot that, that's all the better. If we need to describe the registration plate over the radio to the police or a third party, we need to always use our phonetic alphabet to do so. This includes phonetic letters as well as phonetic numbers. The NATO phonetic alphabet is the alphabet we would prefer everybody to use, and that's the alphabet that's recognized worldwide. The example of this would be A for Alpha, B for Bravo, C for Charlie, D for Delta, etc., etc. Phonetic numbers are just said more clearly with a little bit more emphasis on the ends of the numbers. If you have a group of numbers to say together, we always say them individually. For example, 102 would always be spoken as 102. Let's move on to identifying marks. Identifying marks are anything that stands out on that vehicle. It could be anything from damage, different types of paint used on different parts of the car, racing stripes, or motifs or company names written anywhere on the car. And finally, we have make and model. Now, sometimes you're going to come across vehicles, you may not be a petrol head, you may not know what the make and model is. Try your best at least to get the make right. So for example, Ford, Mercedes, BMW. If you don't know the exact model, just be clear that you're not sure of the model. Again, don't try to fill in information where you don't have the information to hand. In this scenario, we can see we're monitoring a car park as one of our cameras. Car park cameras are very common, but it's difficult to monitor them all the time. They're covering large areas and they're not necessarily going to catch everything at every angle. But in our camera patrol, let's say a car park camera at a train station, we've picked up that someone's been standing in that car park for some time. What we want to do first is zoom in on them to see what exactly are they up to. Can we see what they're doing? Is it innocent or is there something else going on? So if I zoom in here and we look at our target, what does it appear that they're doing? So there's many innocent things that they could be doing. It's always important to note that, and you can log that if you're working in a control room, just to come back and check perhaps in 5 or 10 minutes time, has that person disappeared or are they back? In this situation, what we're looking at is somebody walking up and down trying doors. This is an odd behavior. We wouldn't expect this from a car owner trying lots of different cars' doors. What a suspect may be doing is walking up and down, just looking at the doors to see are there any obvious signs that one of the doors is open. There's two ways to do it. They could do it visually, but quite often what they'll do is they'll walk along the edges of the car and try doors as they're walking. In a situation where we believe a crime is taking place, there's two things we need to do. One, we need to get evidence of the crime taking place itself. So we don't want to be zoomed in so close that you can't actually see what the suspect or target is doing. And two, we want to get a clear identity of the person who's committing that crime. So in this situation, we can see clearly that the suspect is trying doors to a car. Normally, they're going to work quite quickly. It's quite rare that the car itself is going to be taken. More than likely, they're going to go through the car and see if there's anything of value inside it. Sadly, people can leave valuable goods inside vehicles, which are easy picking for people like this. At this point, we would potentially be communicating with the police to pass information in order to get them to dispatch a unit out to the car park. If the police were unable to attend in time and the suspect made off, we would want to get as much detail of them as possible and track them for as long as possible as well. So as they're moving out of the car park, we would track them on camera and switch to, camera 12 in this situation, re-pick up the target and continue to track, as well as pass that information onto either our crew on the ground, security staff on the ground, or to the police themselves. Once we can no longer track them, we would simply be able to give a description of them, hand over any evidence to the police, and give a statement of what we saw as a witness in the situation as well. Producing evidence. Right now what we've done is we've looked at recording evidence and tracking people on camera and making sure that we're getting all the close-ups and screenshots that we need. But what if we need to produce this for the police in order for them to go to potentially the CPS and get a prosecution put through the court system? So in order to assist police with investigations, we need to be very clear on how we produce evidence. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run you through a sort of more modern system of producing evidence. There will be variations to this. Sometimes police may send you a link in which you would simply upload footage to. But for the sake of this exercise, what I'm going to cover is using 2 USBs to produce evidence for the police. So, we have 2 USBs. Now, why do we need 2 USBs? Well, one of them is going to be called a working copy. A working copy simply means that this can be passed directly to the police, signed out, and that's pretty much as far as we're interested in it. What the police will use this footage for is to further their investigation, possibly disclose this to lawyers of suspects, as well as hand over to the CPS as part of the evidence of their investigation for potential prosecution. So this option here, we would call the black and silver USB our working copy. Once we've handed that over to the police, we can pretty much forget about it. The blue USB, that's the important one. Now remember, they both have the exact same footage, images, everything's identical on here. The blue USB is called the original or master copy. Now this one we have to handle in a very specific way. All original copies or master copies must be placed in an evidence bag. Once we have placed that in the evidence bag itself must be sealed, and normally in this situation we would also type up a statement or write up a statement which would also be attached to the evidence bag and would be handed over to the police if the police were going to take it into their custody. I'm now going to go through exactly what type of information needs to go into this evidence bag before it's handed over or put into storage. So let's have a look at how we would do this in practice. Firstly, the evidence bag here is much larger than we would normally use, but that's just purely for demonstration purposes. So once we open up the bag, you'll notice it's got a label on the front. And that label has got to be filled out correctly in order for this to be admissible as evidence to court. So our important copy is our original or master copy, and that's what's going to go inside our evidence bag. So we place that inside the bag, and we would seal the bag. Once again, this bag's a lot larger than we would use. The type of bag we would use for this is probably going to be about the size of an A4 sheet of paper, possibly less than that. We would also staple our statement to the front, and of course, seal the bag. And this, for this example, you can see it's a sealable bag. You'd tear away here and seal that bag and make sure that that bag was completely sealed so nothing could be added or removed from that bag. Primarily, when dealing with an evidence bag as a CCTV controller, we're going to deal with the left-hand side of the bag. Left hand when you're looking at it. So on my right-hand side, but if you were looking at this bag straight up, you'd be looking at the left-hand side. That's really the area that we're interested in. So it starts off, the first thing mentioned is the police force. And that would depend where you work, but things like Thames Valley Police, Metropolitan Police, whoever it might be, that's what you'd put under police force. The next thing you have here is identification reference number, and that identification reference number could come from an internal document where you have an internal reference number for it, or it could be passed on to you. Next up is the court exhibit number. The court exhibit number would be the number that you give it as you produce this evidence. It's normally made up of your initials and a number. If you're producing more than one piece of evidence, normally you would just produce, let's say 3 pieces of evidence. You would have, for example, AM01, AM02, and AM03, and each one would have a different number on it. So you'd have AM01 on the first piece of evidence you created. But for us in this situation, we're only creating one piece of evidence, we're only producing one piece of evidence, and that is, for me in this situation, AM01. So that's the number I would put, or the reference number I would put on the court exhibit number. Then you've got an RV, which we may not have at this point, and that of course is the case itself. So at this point that may not be relevant to us, so we probably wouldn't fill that in, unless the police gave you some more information on that front. So the description is purely what's inside the bag. So in this situation, a blue and silver USB. The rest of the document is very straightforward to fill in, but it's vitally important that we fill it in correctly. So let's go. We've got the time and date that the item was produced. So simply put, we're going to look at our watch, we'll look on the computer screen, we see what the time is, we see what the date is, and we fill it in accurately onto the label. The next thing we're going to look at is where was it produced. Normally in a control room, we're going to give our full control room address. So whichever control room you're at, you'd give the full address in that section right there. Seized or produced by, that would be yourself. As the operator who's produced this evidence, you'd put your details in there. Lastly, your signature, vital. If you don't sign this, quite often this evidence would be moved towards inadmissibility to court. In other words, whatever's on that footage cannot be used in court as evidence. At the bottom of the label, there is information there that we may or may not have to hand. If the police have an incident or crime number, they would give it to you at this stage, and they may fill that out themselves. Then we have further things such as a property number as well as a laboratory number. That would be used if this item was taken for testing, perhaps forensic testing later on. But that's not something us as a control room operator would ever have to fill in. The right-hand side of the label is for whoever takes this into custody. They need to fill out their details on here, and if this was to move at any time, every time somebody handled it, this would need to be completed on the right-hand side. From us as an operator point of view, we're not overly interested in this at all because it's not for us to fill in. This would be for whoever's taken it into custody. The purpose of this is that if this ever were to go to court as evidence, the full lifespan of this evidence is traceable back to its origin with us all the way to the courtroom itself. Of course, when we hand this over to the police, we would still need some evidence that this originated from us. In order to gain that evidence, we will have some kind of document, normally a media movement log, that we would fill out and have the police officer sign out the evidence as well. Important things we would add to this media movement log would be things like our name, our signature, the police officer signing out's name, signature, date, time, and most importantly, the evidence bag number, which is normally situated at the top of the evidence bag. That number is unique to this bag. It's very important that that number matches the bag exactly, because that again proves that this bag came from our control room on this date at this time. Thank you so much for watching this Get Licensed CCTV presentation. Hopefully you found it insightful and it'll help you both in a real life control room as well as on any practical assessments you have to do as part of your course. Thanks again.